In the coming presentation, I will be telling you about what we would say capital-motivated longevity reinsurance. My role is I'm part of a team that, let's say, tries to help our clients with longevity issues. And in that context, this presentation is, let's say, touching upon, well, let's say, some latest developments. Let me start with something that has been mentioned already before. I very much realize the longevity indemnity swaps. They are, I'm keen to stress again that they are reinsurance, despite the name. So they're not a derivative, they're reinsurance, indemnity reinsurance based on a specific portfolio. As David also mentioned, most of the activity up to date is happening in the UK in these transactions. We are also active in that. They are relatively simple transactions, although we all know that being involved in these transactions, that if you, let's say, implement them, there are always all kinds of challenges, but let's say the starting point is relatively simple. There's two legs, moving back to the, let's say, the derivative terminology, a leg of fixed payments, the premiums, and a leg of floating payments, the benefits. I mentioned them here. So this is where the transaction happens. The insurance company and, of course, hopefully RGA. These are the fixed leg, the premiums, and these are the actual benefits for that correspond to the liability that the insurance company has towards its policyholders. So through these transactions, all the longevity risk of an in-force block is transferred to the reinsurance company. That's, let's say, nice. However, well, this is then another graph actually explaining those cash flows. So you see here on the bottom part, you see the fixed cash flows, and here on the top part, you see the floating cash flows that are uncertain depending on how mortality develops. And instead of making these huge payments, we do the net. There's no value, of course, in transferring these huge amounts. So there are net payments done, and depending on how mortality develops, there's a net payment either from the reinsurer to the insurance company or the other way around. A big challenge in transferring longevity risk is agreeing upon the price. And there's been a lot of talk about, of course, over these past days about mortality improvements. And it turned also, Jessica was actually referring to it. What we see a lot in, let's say, across the globe, and then for me it's more, let's say, in Europe, is that insurance companies sometimes, for whatever reasons, use, in our view, quite aggressive assumptions. So let's say, in our view, too low mortality improvements, or sometimes even no mortality improvements at all, in setting their reserves. And there can be all kinds of reasons, we realize that. But the outcome of that is that if you subsequently start talking about transferring longevity risk, which actually quite some insurance companies that have longevity risk in the books are quite keen to do, because experience has learned with increased life expectancy that having these liabilities and having to increase these liabilities is painful, as we very much realize. So they are interested in general in transferring longevity risk. But then you start speaking about what would be the costs, and unfortunately then typically it's perceived as expensive. And I'm keen to stress perceived. We think that it's a reasonable price, but we also understand why the insurance company perceives it as expensive. And that has to do with these mortality improvements. You can decompose the price of a longevity swap in three components. The starting mortality rate, so the starting Q-axis, just two columns of current mortality rates for the males and the females. Typically those can be, let's say, well, they are based on the experience that the insurance company offers, that it has available, credibility is of course taken into account, and typically it's doable to get an agreement on those. The main challenge is these improvements. Of course, we also don't know how improvements will be. That's, of course, why we yesterday also had these, well, let's say, very interesting presentations, and why, let's say, many research is still done in that area. It's a challenge, but we have a certain view, and we are willing to take the risk of longevity based on those assumptions. But that's the second component, and that has a big impact in the price, in the sense that if there's a difference between what we believe is reasonable improvements and what the client believes are reasonable improvements, then that can have a huge impact on the price. The third component is then something that's also worth mentioning. It's let's say, the compensation for our cost and the capital that we need to hold. Because it's important, and I'm keen to stress that once you get an agreement on the mortality assumptions, then still you're covering the expected benefits. And there's uncertainty in the benefits. Nobody will deny that, I would say. So, and for that uncertainty, capital needs to be held, and that's, we need to make a certain return on that capital for our shareholders. So that's the third component of let's say, the cost. But then what's the, let's say, the painful part is this so-called catch-up premium. It's of course just a name, but what it's about is that because of the difference in mortality improvements that are assumed by the insurance company or by the reinsurance company, that there can be, let's say, an additional premium, which I label here as catch-up premium, which is, let's say, makes the longevity swap at least perceived as expensive. And that's what we see, let's say, well, in many countries and for many clients. And then subsequently, let's say the next reasoning is then, okay, but before I go there, let me, so I was based in the Netherlands, as I said, and I'm keen to show this slide. It's not as impressive as the transactions are happening in the UK, but there is at least some activity in the Netherlands. These are, let's say, the 5 transactions that have happened today that are public. They're disclosed on the Artemis website here as well. We're happy to be part of 2 of them. So 2 large insurance companies in the Netherlands have done longevity transactions. Of course, how these transactions look in detail is, of course, not public. But there is some information disclosed, like, for instance, the size of the transactions. And by size, I put it on purpose between brackets, because this is, let's say, the underlying reserves. These are not like longevity swaps that are happening in the UK. And my presentation will be about, let's say, these kind of transactions, without going into detail on any of these specifically. But in general, they have, let's say, some common characteristics, which I'll explain. Another aspect of, let's say, when you talk about transferring longevity risk is the distinction between indemnity and general population, and sometimes referred to as index. I like the term general population a bit better because I believe there's no real index, but you can consider this index as well. Later on, there will be a presentation from another company who will, from SocGen, who will describe this and also go into the things about basis risk. But these are just, let's say, a list of, let's say, things that are relevant, and when you consider these 2. So the bottom line is that both transactions can be done. So you can do either transaction on an indemnity basis or on a general population basis. And what this table shows is that both transactions have their, or both approaches have their pros and cons. So it's up to the insurance company, and of course we're happy to help with, let's say, understanding the things, but to decide which transaction is most attractive for them. One thing there are a few things I would like to highlight. One is the including of the deferreds. So those are the, let's say, the annuity, let's say the policy holders that are still in accumulation stage. They have accrued benefits, but have not retired yet. And typically, those are not included in longevity swaps in the UK. To a limited extent, they're sometimes included, but it's very limited. In these, let's say, the transactions I will be talking about, it is quite possible to include them. So that's also why I listed that here. Another aspect is so-called transfer. So that refers to if you have accrued benefits of people that are also still in accumulation phase, but may move their whole benefits from one company to the other. So if you have a policyholder that's moving moving to another employer, and they in the Netherlands, that's very well possible. It's very much allowed that you can transfer the benefits that you accrued from one insurance company to the other, or from a pension fund to an insurance company, or the other way around. So those kind of things are things that insurance companies need to, well, they are very much aware of it, and they need to accommodate that. And of course, if you do transactions like this, you need to be, let's say, prepared for that as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt. I hope you're still awake after the lunch. Of course, there will be, in the end, will also be room for questions. And I'm around also these days. So now moving to these specific transactions. So capital motivated longevity transactions. The way we look at capital motivated transactions is that you try to strike an attractive balance between cost and benefits. Let me explain that in a bit more detail. What we mean by that is that, let's say, if you, let's say, as an insurance company, if you have longevity risk and you are, let's say, exploring transferring that risk, what we hear quite often is that on one hand, it's nice to release all the risk, to transfer all the risk. On the other hand, once they then see the costs, then indeed, well, it happens that indeed insurance companies then realize, whoa, that's something I'm not willing to pay. And then we have a subsequent, let's say, meeting discussion about, okay, but what's your true objectives? And I'm now giving, let's say, a very summarized version, but it happens where insurance companies then say, okay, but indeed, I'm not that worried about, let's say, transferring all my longevity risk. I actually am more keen to release some of my longevity SCR. So under Solvency II, there's an explicit capital charge for longevity risk, and insurance companies that have relatively a lot of longevity risk relatively to the other risks that they have, are interested, or quite a few of them are interested to release that. And capital motivated reinsurance is finding, let's say, about finding an attractive balance between releasing capital and on the other hand at an attractive cost. And how we do that is by, let's say, tailoring these transactions so that the amount of risk that's transferred is, let's say, reduced, which reduces obviously the cost. But on the other hand, we're keen to, let's say, release, let's say, still in a sizable amount of capital. And that's the whole, let's say, puzzle that we try to solve. And if you talk about improving capital, there are two, let's say, things that I want to stress, is that actually both sides of the solvency ratio can be improved, as I list here. So obviously there's the reduction in the longevity SCR, but there's also the increase in own funds, because reductions in longevity SCR reduce your risk margin, which is based on the present value of the projected future SCRs, and reducing the risk margin, because it's an on-balance sheet item on the Solvency II balance sheet, will increase your own funds. So through these transactions, it's very much possible to improve both sides of the solvency ratio. Then, in explaining these transactions, I put here a graph with cash flows. Please keep in mind the cash flows I showed earlier with the longevity swap. These are very different. Here you see that there are typically level premiums paid by the insurer to the reinsurer or to the risk taker. Let's say quarterly premiums fixed at inception over the term of the transaction, full stop. And then there is one potential longevity benefit paid by the risk taker. And I put that here as a dotted line because I'm keen to stress that it's a potential payment. Actually, and I'll show you later, under most scenarios there will be no benefit paid. And that's something that we're keen to stress, because that should not be an issue. Because the benefit of these transactions is to improve the capital position at a, let's say, an attractive cost, and not so much to transfer, let's say, all the longevity risk. Of course, there is longevity risk transferred, and I'll explain in more detail, but that's the whole, let's say, the important aspect of these transactions. So improving the capital position at attractive costs relative to, let's say, the other means that are available to improve capital, as insurance companies, of course, very much know, and you know as well. So then zooming in on how can we reduce the amount of longevity risk that's transferred. And typically there are two dimensions. One is the change in mortality rates, and the other one is the term of the transaction. The term I'll explain later, but the short version is the shorter the term, the less risk you transfer, and thereby the cheaper it gets. And the change in mortality rates, what we can do is we can say, well, insurance company, you can retain some of the, let's say, the change in mortality yourself, like a retention, and so that the cover only kicks in if mortality rates reduce beyond a certain level. And the next graph shows that in, let's say, a few examples. So here we have, on the horizontal axis, we have the cumulative change in mortality over the term of the transaction. What you see here on the left-hand side, we have the best estimate. So that's, let's say, the client's current best estimate mortality, which typically would, of course, include already mortality improvements. And then if you move to the right, you see that, let's say, there are, let's say, changes in mortality on top of what's already assumed. So a 10% change means here that the mortality rates are reducing by more than 10%, by 10% beyond what's already assumed in the mortality improvements. And what these three lines represent, let's say, just potential transactions, just, let's say, to illustrate. So, for instance, this middle line shows a transaction where the first 10% drop beyond the current best estimate is retained by the client. As of that moment, the transaction starts to generate a benefit, which increases, and then by the time the mortality increase reduction would be beyond 20%, then there's a maximum reached. It's not strictly necessary to have a maximum, but of course having a maximum also helps on, let's say, again, reducing the cost. And then you can do all kinds of, let's say, variations around it. So that's about the mortality rates. That's the one dimension. The other dimension is a bit more challenging. That's about the term. We very much realize that longevity risk is a long-term risk, as we hear about this, let's say, at this conference, in every presentation. You can do a longevity swap and say, let's just do a longevity swap that terminates after 10 years or 5 years. But what you see here in this graph, this is a graph of projected annuities under different mortality scenarios, just an example. But what you see is that over the first, let's say, in this case, 10 years, what you see is that the deviations are very limited. Because longevity risk is a long-term risk, so changes in mortality rates only, let's say, affect annuities, let's say, really, let's say, in the very far future. So that's what you see here. So simply doing a longevity swap that, let's say, stops after 10 years transfers very little risk. It can be done, we're happy to do it, but it gives also a limited benefit. So how about doing something more, let's say, sophisticated? And that's what we're doing here by including also the present value of the future annuities beyond the term of the swap, of the transaction. And I refer here to the capital motivated transactions as a longevity shock absorber. That's just the label that we use to explain these transactions and to distinguish them from the longevity swaps as generally done in the UK. So this component is part of the transaction, and I'll explain in more detail what that component is about, and I think that's the most challenging part of the transaction, but it's crucial to give the benefits that the clients are after. So here I zoom in on that component. It's this, let's say, this arrow as I just showed. It increases the benefit, as I said. Because all the, let's say, annuities over the full term of the portfolio are taken into account. And what it does, you can, well, describe it in various ways, but it takes account of the change in the annuities beyond the term of the transaction, but based on the mortality experience during the term. So that's an important, let's say, distinction. So we look at how it's based on the annuities beyond the term, but it only takes account of how those annuities would change because of experience emerging during the term. And please keep in mind the cash flows that I showed you a few slides earlier. Once the transaction terminates, in this example, let's say after 10 years, there are no cash flows anymore beyond that term. So anything that happens here, let's say 20 years from now, has no impact on the transaction. Another way to phrase it is like this. So it's about it's the difference between how we project these annuities at inception relative to how they are projected at maturity. And for that purpose, we need a mortality model. Like yesterday, there have been plenty of mortality models. For instance, the Licardo model, of course, or all the very exotic and fancy extensions that have been developed since then. Our, let's say, starting point is that we're fine to consider any model. Actually, we would encourage the insurance company to make up or to, let's say, to use the model they're currently using. On the other hand, we're also, of course, very happy to think along with the insurance company about what would be an appropriate model. For us, it's crucial that the model is known at inception. It may seem obvious, but that's important. So we cannot say, with all due respect to, let's say, the local actuarial associations or the, let's say, national statistical agencies. I know in the Netherlands, I'm based in the Netherlands, there the Dutch Actuarial Association publishes every 2 years at the moment a new mortality model. They're doing a great job in that. I truly find that. But we cannot say, with all due respect to them, let's use the model that they will produce in 10 years from now. Because that's too much a carte blanche. We don't know what kind of model, nobody knows what kind of model they will produce. So we need to agree upon a model now. And we need to agree upon how we will calibrate that model after 10 years. And that's, let's say, so you get to these kind of things, of course, the mortality rates, we've seen them, well, plenty of, and that's, of course, very important for these transactions. So it's an important component, as I said, it needs to be pre-agreed. It's also relevant for setting the attachment and the detachment point. It's recalibrated at maturity, and we should know how it will be recalibrated now. Because we need, of course, to know what our liability is in doing these transactions. Okay. Yes?
So does that mean that if during the term of the transaction expectations about future long-term rates of improvement were to change, will the payoff at maturity reflect that or not reflect that?
The short answer is it will not reflect it. But so what these transactions do is that they are based on mortality experience emerging during the term. So to the extent that, let's say, medical or whatever things are advancing and people are realizing lower mortality rates, then that is captured in the transaction. But the most extreme case, indeed, what if, let's say, at a conference like this, 10 years from now, it's announced that breakthrough a medicine against cancer has been developed, that would not affect this transaction, because at that moment it will not be reflected in the mortality rates. So it will not change the benefit paid under this transaction. Yeah. Okay, the final part of my presentation is, let's say, a numerical example, just to give you a bit more insight in how a transaction like this would work. And I'll do it a bit quickly, but there's a lot to say about these transactions. But so just a portfolio with accrued benefits. I will focus actually on how the mortality of the longevity SCRs are projected. What the projected reduction in longevity SCR will be. So not just current longevity SCR, but also how the projected longevity SCR will reduce over time. So we start simple. I've picked here a very simple model, not even, let's say, let's say much simpler than Lee Carter already. But for this purpose, it does the job. It's let's say a model that's calibrated over, let's say, in this case, a 20-year period. These are general Dutch population, male, 50-year-old mortality rates, as have been the red lines is what's realized. This blue line is, let's say, what's calibrated through that model. And that's, let's say, let's assume that that's the client's best estimate. I'm also ignoring the difference between general population and insured population for this purpose. Then you have the longevity SCR shock for the standard formula. That's simply, let's say, the 20% shock that insurance companies that follow the standard formula have to apply to determine their longevity SCR. So far, so good. Then we move to the next slide, and that's the most complicated one, I realize. But what's happening here, and that's a very crucial element of the transaction, is that at the end of the transaction, we will do various calculations, but one is the crucial one, which is look at what mortality experience has emerged during the term and recalibrate the model. And here I demonstrate what happens, let's say, if you set the attachment and the detachment points. Those will be set at inception, but here I show how they are determined. So what you see is that here we've assumed a 5 and a 15% drop for the attachment and the detachment point. And we assume that during the term of the transaction, so during the 10-year term. And then we recalibrate this mortality model to project mortality rates beyond the term. And what you see, and that's the very, very important to realize, is that this is, let's say, the in-sample one. So let's look at this green one, the bottom one, so corresponding to the 15% drop. If you have... So here you see the drop, but what you see here is an important aspect, an important feature. Because what's happening there is that this red line is the 20% drop that corresponds to the 20% shock in longevity for the standard formula. But what you see here is that the 15% drop during the term actually results in mortality rates in the far future that are more extreme than the 20% shock of the longevity SCR for Solvency II. And that's, well, from a modeling perspective, not shocking, but it's something that says, I mean, the first reaction from clients is that this can't be, or this seems very strange, because you assume a 15% detachment, and actually the mortality rates corresponding to that 15% detachment are more extreme than the 20% shock of longevity. But that's just because if you do this calibration, you can say there's some kind of leverage, or you're exaggerating what's you're in the extrapolation, you're making the effect more extreme. And that's not a problem. It's something to realize, and actually it's beneficial for the insurance companies because it helps in increasing the longevity benefit. And that's actually here in this graph, and I'm almost done. So what you see here is that you have then, the red line is just, let's say, the longevity SCR, how it's projected to reduce over the term of the transaction without any transaction in place. So just the runoff of the portfolio. And then the blue line is how much benefit this transaction would generate, as in how much longevity SCR reduction this transaction would generate. And what you see is that it's very close to the total longevity SCR, despite the fact that it attaches at 5% and detaches at 15%. So you could say it only covers 10% of the 20% shock, but still it's almost inception, almost covering the full longevity SCR, and then even here during this period it's covering the full longevity SCR, and then in the later term it's reducing over the remaining term of the transaction. And that's something very important to realize. Clients that will replicate these calculations as well as they should will find out themselves. But that's an important aspect of these transactions, and it's very attractive, actually, I believe. So and then my final slide is showing similar curves, but then for different attachment and detachment points. So the curve I just showed was this blue one. That corresponded to 15% attachment, detachment. But you can do, of course, transactions with different attachment and detachment points. What you see here is that if you go further in the tail, you have a low reduction in longevity SCR, obviously, but you also have a cheaper transaction. So that trade-off is something for the insurance company to make. And if you then go to the right, you have your, let's say, closer at the money, to speak in option terminology. So you generate more benefit, also over a longer term, but you still, it's also more expensive. So that trade-off needs to be made. So my last slide, conclusion. Well, we think this is definitely a transaction that insurance companies that have, let's say, relatively a lot of longevity SCR, and that are, let's say, keen to improve their capital position, we believe they should consider this. I'm actually quite confident that this transaction can, let's say, from a cost perspective and cost-benefit perspective, can benefit, or let's say, will win compared to the alternatives, or at least it will do very well. Well, and then, yeah, so that's my last point. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if when your clients are working out their capital, they're allowing for the asymmetry of outcomes. So I guess the easiest way to think about that is if they bought one with an attachment point of 0 and a detachment of 20, would they hold any capital at all?
Well, during the term of the transaction, the short answer is they would indeed completely eliminate their longevity SCR. Yeah, yes, but the asymmetry is also how capital, capital is supposed to...
But I suppose the 20% is supposed to represent, you know, a probability of 5, a probability of 10, a probability of 30. And so they're effectively ignoring the probability that it could be beyond 20%. I'm wondering if regulators will let them get away with that.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair point, and I agree that you can say that these kind of transactions are, yeah, let's say, tailored to the regulation, arbitrage, those kind of things. The way we look at it is that it's a fair point, indeed, but that's also, let's say, it's completely within the rules. Solvency II does allow this. You can enter into reinsurance under Solvency II. On the other hand, it's fair to say that there is a cap to amount of risk that you transfer. If there can be, let's say, more extreme mortality developments than covered by this transaction, and let's say the risk in the, let's say, the really far end of the tail is retained by the client. Whether the client needs to hold capital for that, yeah, according to Solvency II, I would say no. But yeah, that's let's say up to, yeah, indeed, regulators have a say, of course. I very much realize, yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Oh, there's one thing.
Yeah.
That's the last one.
It's tantalizing you say that, is this working?
Yes.
Yeah.
You cannot use a model for 10 years in a time perspective when we are talking 70 years and so on. Which is commonplace because anything can happen. And in these circumstances and with such long-term contracts, it would be advisable to design the contracts in the first place so that the premiums as well as the benefits follow the indices so as to achieve both solvency and meet possibly certain targets for the pension levels. And that was, of course, in place in the good old days when we had with profit. I reiterate what I said yesterday then. So all these transfers of this self-created and self-inflicted risk shouldn't really necessarily be brought to the market. And then I have a question which I haven't been able to find any answer to by looking into the publicly available data sources. How much does it all cost? And it has to come from the pension savings. How much does all this risk transfer cost in administration, keeping all the experts going, and so on and so on?
Well, I mean, insurance companies need to hold capital for the risks they run. And of course, there's regulation around how much capital they need to hold. And in my view, insurance companies are also incentivized to, let's say, manage their capital efficiently. So if they can, through these kind of transactions, reduce the amount of capital they need to hold and thereby reduce the cost relative to if they have to hold the capital themselves and generate a return for their shareholders, it can well be a more attractive proposition for the pensioners or the policyholders to do transactions like this. I mean, it's all. I mean, the capital needs to be held anyway, needs to be held anyway. So it's the trade-off that the insurance companies need to make. But yeah, I don't agree that therefore these transactions shouldn't happen. I mean, it's the insurance companies need to hold capital or transfer risk, and that. Well, but then the individuals have the longevity risk, you mean, the policyholders?
Well, it has been created by the very design of the policies.
Yeah, but I think it's also good for a simple consumer to have the possibility to have a lifetime annuity. So, I mean, I'm happy that I... Okay.
Well, we'll have to discuss that.
Yeah, I will do that later. Okay, thank you. Yeah.